Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Society. Tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mike Murray, who has been a very long-term friend of us all here at the Society, and he does an enormous amount of work for Buddhism, particularly with Jamyang, where he organizes their spiritual program. He's also worked for us. He was at one time our reviews editor for the Middle Way. He's got an MA in Buddhist Studies from SOAS, and tonight's talk, which I'm very interested in personally, and presumably you are too as you've come, pre-modern and postmodern Buddhism, some reflections on transition of Tibetan Buddhism to Europe and America. And we are going through the most enormous change, really, in people's attitude towards Buddhism. Having been in America recently, it's very evident that their attitude to Buddhism is really quite is in some ways, from a sort of purist like myself, a bit shocking, because they go around and pick and match, and they do a little bit of Theravada, a little bit of Tibetan Buddhism, and so on. So I'd be very interested in Mike's sort of reflections on this tonight. So Mike, thank you very, very much indeed. Will you have a bit of time for questions afterwards?
Sure, yes. What time should I shut up at?
Well, around about 25 past, half past.
Yep, fine.
If you want to go on that long, however long you want.
Yeah.
And then, if you've got time for, say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions.
Sure, yes.
That'd be great too. Yeah. I think the other tradition we have is that people want to leave at half past to get trains and get home that they can. And our speakers are not normally ever offended by that. So if you want to get out, then please go. So Mike, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for coming tonight. Yes, you all have other things you could be doing, so thank you for devoting this time to being here. Can we just start by having a bit of quiet and meditation together, as that's the core of Buddhism, really. So. Whatever is your comfortable position and whatever is your standard meditation practice, then if you drop into that. If you don't have a standard practice, if you just follow the breath, become aware of your breathing and center your mind into here, this room, your body, your presence here. Oh yes, and beware the mobile phone. Thank you. Thank you. So, the title of the talk, pre-modern and post-modern Buddhism, and some reflections on transition of Tibetan Buddhism to Europe and America, is really a kind of catch-all for some things that I think we should be aware of as the traditions move to the West, in inverted commas, and just as a kind of opener for thinking about, really. So, if I've given these isms of pre-modern and post-modern and Buddhism, I should explain myself a little bit, I guess. By pre-modern Buddhism, I mean the Buddhisms that we are receiving from Asia that have a long tradition, nurtured primarily in non-industrial societies, rigid social structures, limited lay literacy rates, where the monastic sangha were held in high regard and given special privileges, as were the temples and monasteries. So in Tibet, as most people know, the monasteries owned a lot of land, had many people working on their land. They were at the kind of top edge of the society, if you like. Within the monasteries in Tibet, the monastic learning was what you call scholastic. So in the classic medieval sense of it explored the tradition, it worked out the tradition, but it never challenged the tradition, and it never pushed the boundaries of the tradition. It was very much within the circumscribed area. You see it very much in European learning of the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, Christian learning. It's that same style. It's all right to look within the tradition and to argue within it, but it's not really considered proper to move outside or to push the boundaries or challenge the boundaries. And that tends to have led in the traditional Buddhisms to a kind of aversion to innovation in many cases. Not always, but in many cases. The classic case in my school, the Geluk, is that if you produced a text that your fellow scholars didn't think was up to the scratch or was overtly challenging the system, it would be tied to the tail of a dog and then chased through Lhasa with this dog dragging the text on the ground as a sign of disapproval. That's not to say that I'm using pre-modern in a pejorative sense. I'm not. I actually find a lot of pre-modern attitudes encouraging, and I personally find them beneficial, if you like. And similarly, that also means in a lot of postmodern actions, I tend to find a bit weird, to be frank, a bit off-putting. Postmodern Buddhism, I mean the various kinds of Buddhism that are starting to emerge within our culture. So in Tibetan Buddhism, we have this phrase, the West, which drives me up the wall, to be honest. Americans are not the same as English are not the same as Scots, we're certainly not the same as Russians, we're certainly not the same as Italians. There's a huge variety of cultures going on in the West. So America and Europe, I think you can make some distinctions between. There are European patterns, but the West I'm not keen on. So we have a lot of new Buddhist groups coming up in Europe, and also in America, some of which are very much strongly allied to tradition, some of which are less allied to tradition. And you can have two groups within that. You can have, of these Buddhisms in Europe, you have three, don't you? You have the Buddhisms that are there for expatriate communities, the temples that deal with Sri Lankans and deal with Thais and deal with Burmese, deal with Nepalese. Not really Tibetans, there aren't enough of them. The Tibetan temples are always run by Europeans, basically. And then you have like one set of traditional groups. Then you have groups that are mainly European. You could cite the Triratna, people like that, or even the Buddhist Society, as a group that is mainly run by Europeans. It's not run for the benefit of expat communities. And then finally you end up with these new groups that are emerging that in some way are claiming tradition and in some ways are moving away from tradition. There's a lot of interesting eddies going on at the moment, which shows it's almost natural in the sense you have something coming into a completely different cultural context, things are bound to change. This is one of our fundamental Buddhist truths, isn't it? Everything changes, nothing stays the same. And I think also we need to think about what's happening in Asia, because in Asia, where these traditional flows have come from, there is massive change going on there. Massive change. They're meeting ideas such as scientific method, free speech, critical thinking, critical inquiry, democracy, education for all, equal rights, women's reproductive health, control over it. All these things that weren't there 100 years ago are there now. And that's affecting the way youngsters in particular deal with Buddhism and deal with their traditions and deal with their parents' tradition as well. So a little history. The meeting of Buddhism with the modern world, if you take the European-American paradigm as modern, which is questionable, has produced varied results, hasn't it? In many parts of Asia, traditional Buddhist cultures, not solely Buddhist cultures, were taken over by communism. Buddhism in those countries generally was part of the status quo before. It supported the elite and was supported by the elite. And as a result of that, when the communists took control, they oppressed Buddhism very heavily. In some parts, there was massive destruction of monasteries, massive oppression of the monastics. Other parts, it was less obvious. And you have very mixed results. In Mongolia, there was huge destruction of monastic property. Many monastics were killed. Very few survived. Many statues were destroyed. Many stupas were destroyed. Many paintings were destroyed. Many tankas were destroyed. But the books, Mongolians have a deep reverence for learning and for knowledge. The books weren't destroyed. They tended to be taken to the depositories in Ulaanbaatar and just stuck in there, left there. So when the regime changed, and you had a kind of the new Mongolian regime of democratic Mongolia coming in, there were these vast stores of books, and they weren't neatly piled away like in the library. They were literally just thrown in there. So for many, there have been about 4 or 5 scholars whose entire job seems to have been just finding which volume goes with which set. In Tibet, there was enormous destruction of written works and books. And even actually after the regime became less oppressive about Buddhism, because the books had been damaged, the old ones were still being destroyed and burnt, and that I found very interesting. When I was in Tibet in '87, there was a brief period when it was quite easy to move around, and you'd go and see these kind of bound volumes that had been put together by people who'd found all the pages they could for this particular volume, but because there wasn't enough of it, if you like, it wasn't whole, it wasn't complete, it was damaged and impure in a sense. So when they got the new printing of the volume, they would just very reverently destroy the old one to make sure that, and it was all done with great reverence, but for somebody like me who's a trained art historian, I was just weeping at the fact that these 14th century manuscripts had been consigned to the flames, and I was quite happy to have one page. In fact, I have 2, nice 1 pages of big text. You can understand they wanted a whole text, but these old things were, being consigned to the flames as part of the rebuilding and the reclaiming of their Buddhist heritage, in a sense. Different ways of working with these things. In Kampuchea, huge damage to the Buddhist culture was done. And then now you have this funny thing where even in communist countries or post-communist countries, there's a lot of emphasis of the Buddhist culture because it shows the pan-Asian nature of, Chinese share with Mongolians, with Thai, there's this shared culture. And then you have the parts of Buddhist Asia that didn't get taken over by communism, and you have mixed results there. You have in Thailand and Burma and Sri Lanka, to some extent or another, although people say that Burma has still got some kind of purity to it, but certainly in Thailand there are some interesting, very seemingly materialistic streams of Buddhism starting up. And also in all of the countries there tends to be an association of Buddhism with the Sinhala in Sri Lanka, Buddhism with the Burmans in Burma, Buddhism with the Thai in Thailand, and there are other nationalities within those countries who don't actually kind of fit the paradigm, so they find it quite difficult. So in one sense, there's a sort of politicization of Buddhism, which probably has always been there, but what has come with it is a kind of national grouping, which or maybe race identity or a tribe identity, if you like, that I'm not sure was there in the past. So Buddhism moved into Europe, and it moved in from the 1920s, gained pace in the 70s, 80s, I guess. That's the real when things started to sort of move dramatically for the Tibetans. The Tibetans came out into exile in 59 through to 61, basically. And then it was only really in the early 70s when they started to be able to refound monasteries and develop their own culture in exile in India. But from the London point of view, if you like, we've ended up with Japanese Buddhism, Korean Buddhism. We have Buddhism everywhere. In the same way that we have restaurants from all over the world, we have Buddhisms from all over the world, don't we? You know, my mothers are going on for ringing me up on the phone going, there's another Buddhist group in London, you know. Yes, I know. There are a lot. And there are traditional ones that would call themselves traditional, through to people who are deliberately bucking some aspects of the tradition. There are people who are mixing psychology, psychotherapy with Buddhism, people who are bringing in other forms of science with Buddhism. There's a whole range of stuff going on here. And that's, for me, when I was at School of Oriental and African Studies, I was very lucky to meet a teacher called Dr. Alexander Piatigorsky, who was a phenomenology of religion person, which I had never heard of in my life. And Sasha, everyone called him Sasha, was an extraordinary mind. And he would, although he himself was a practicing Buddhist, he always insisted that even as a practicing Buddhist, you should be aware of what's happening in your religion, aware of why you engage with certain things in certain ways. And so the phenomenon of Buddhism in this town, or in this country, or in Europe, is very interesting, because we have these kind of rocks, if you like, of the traditional Buddhisms, and then there are eddies going on around them, lots of different eddies going on around them. And Sasha was fascinated by these things. He found them very interesting indeed. One of the great difficulties with having any kind of seminar with Sasha was that you would always start off with, Michael, we'll have a drink now. So you've got a large shot of vodka, a large lump of greasy sausage, and then he did a ritual which they do in Mongolia to offer to the gods and the land, and then you ate the sausage and downed the vodka, and half an hour into the lecture suddenly it was like, chunk, and you've lost control of your mind. Whereas he could quite happily go on for hours. But very interesting man, and this phenomenology of religion is very Buddhist in a way, to practice the religion and also to have that distance to see yourself practicing the religion. It's a very Buddhist way. So these eddies are coming in and out. And I just wanted to look at some what I consider main or interesting parts of traditional Buddhism to see how they're faring over here. So I wanted to look at rebirth and karma, and I wanted to look at faith in particular. But also there are other things. You know, there are still many in the traditions that say that Europeans can't really hold the monastic vows, that Europeans can't really hold the bodhisattva vows, that Europeans find it very difficult to hold the tantra vows. And whilst that's something to be aware of, it's also something to look at, to analyse, to watch from our side. A number of the eddies that we have at the moment seem to be moving towards positions which don't accept that the teachings on rebirth and karma refer to direct things, if you like, or direct processes, that they're kind of elusive, that they're allegories or they are metaphors. And some actually go to the further, if you like, and would say that they are cultural accretions. They are not part of original Buddhism, and they are part of, in this case, the Indian cultural mix. And so in order to speak to people who live in the Indian cultural mix, you have to use the language that they understand. And rebirth and karma are part of that language. And some others tend to say that there's no need to think about rebirth or karma. Just work with this life. Think about this life, being good in this life, working in this life. Now, traditionally, these people would have been accused of being immoral, amoral, because they don't believe in rebirth and karma. And for instance, so in the tenet text that we study in Tibetan Buddhism, there are people called Charvakas who are materialists, and you always learn that the Charvakas don't believe in rebirth and karma. And then you also learn that the founder of the Charvaka tradition slept with his daughter and slaughtered this animal and all these kind of things. But when you read the Indian darshan texts, you don't get that at all. It's just, the man was actually very bright and not amoral, immoral. I don't particularly want to argue that karma and rebirth are right or wrong, or that they actually exist, or that they're metaphors. It's just that in the phenomenology of religion, and we're dealing with Buddhism, and we're dealing with Tibetan Buddhism, if you don't accept karma and rebirth, then the goal of Buddhism, of Buddhist practice, needs to be revisioned, doesn't it? Because the goal of Buddhism, the goal of Buddhist practice, however far off it is to become arhat, to become Buddha, to become a fully enlightened Buddha, yes? Anyone who does meditation, or tries to do meditation, discovers that the mind is quite unruly, So if you take fully enlightened Buddha, or enlightenment as the goal in Buddhism, that state is when you could say it's when you've managed to get rid of anger out of your mind, obsessive attachment out of your mind, ignorance that underlies those two out of your mind. Not there's a temporary cessation, but it's gone completely, never to come back. Quite difficult. When you sit in meditation and you see how unfocused the mind can be and how influenced by external events the mind can be. We travel across London to come here, and then we try and calm our minds. And if we're lucky, we get 3 or 4 minutes when we're just present. If we're unlucky, we're having an argument with somebody in the tube, although we never had an argument with somebody in the tube. We're shopping in Tesco's. We're talking to George. We're talking to Jackie. We're thinking about television. We're the mind is rabbiting on. So, in order to be a fully enlightened Buddha, you can't have a mind that rabbits on. And in order to stop the mind being a rabbiting on mind that is riddled with or prone to anger, obsessive attachment and ignorance, to me, just from my own experience, I think it's going to take slightly longer than one lifetime. So to me, part and parcel of the phenomenon of religion, of phenomenon of Buddhism as a religion, seems to not quite demand, but say that you need to think that there are other lives because it's very difficult to get to the goal in this life. It's not to say that these people who are proposing that we work in this life to deal with these things are, bad or anything like that. It's just an interesting phenomenon that is happening. But when there is only this life, the goal of arhat, the goal of fully enlightened Buddha in particular, the goal of Mahabodhisattva, becomes almost unreachable for most of us, even for the monastics, for the yogins, for the people in meditation. And what tends to happen with some of the ideas is that the goal is revisioned. It's about being a blame-free person, a happy person, a contented life, often while working in an alternative therapy centre. Nothing wrong with it, but it's not Arhat. It's not Samyak Sambuddha. We need to be clear about that. And that great thing that man makes God in his own image. I think sometimes us Buddhists tend to remake the gold to fit with what we can possibly do in this lifetime, rather than deal with that rather tricky thing of karma and rebirth, whether they run together. So I just leave that open. And now we go to faith and conviction. And this, Tsongkhapa's the founder of the tradition that we follow at Jamyang Buddhist Center. Great 14th century Tibetan mystic. He calls faith the root of the path. It's Shraddha or Dyepa. Dyepa Tibetan, Shraddha in Sanskrit. It's not just a Tibetan tradition, it's also in Theravada, and I presume in Far Eastern Buddhisms, but I don't know them, that faith is emphasized. But faith is a difficult term for us in English, isn't it? It comes with a range of meanings depending where you're coming from. I come from, half of my family is a Scot, my dad is a Scot, from the sort of Protestant end of Scottishness, who rejected the Protestant end of Scottishness quite early in his life and got into Bertrand Russell and things like that. My mother comes from Church of Ireland, Northern Irish Protestants, again not that interested in the Protestantism of Northern Ireland, and Christianity in Northern Ireland has a certain flavour that many people find extremely distasteful, So one of their classic hurts was when a friend of them said, "How come two of you have produced a son who's interested in Buddhism?" But faith. For many of us it conjures up an image of blind faith, fundamentalism, intolerance, a closed, fixated mind. It's the kind of mind that enables the most appalling atrocities to be committed by seemingly rational people. For others, it conjures up a sense of certainty, or conviction, or joy. The kind of mind that's composed sublime music, produced uplifting art, that has been the core of some of the most compassionate and wise minds to walk this planet. They all get called faith at times, these things. You think of a lot of beautiful art has been produced out of faith, So some of the interesting eddies in our current mix don't have much truck with faith, really, and emphasize rationality and reason. Again, I've got nothing wrong with that. Sometimes they say that faith is old-fashioned, slightly naive, blinkered, not really rational, often totally irrational. I've got great sympathy with emphasizing rationality in Buddhism, because I think many of the traditional Buddhisms are a bit over-heavy on faith and not a lot on investigation. Maybe I've been poisoned by scientific method, but we need to investigate as Buddhists. We need to look, we need to learn. We need to look in the laboratory of our minds here, this mind-body complex, But I do have some problems with downplaying the role of faith. And it comes back to this thing of sitting here, trying to get the mind going properly, get anger out of the mind, the tendency to anger out of the mind, attachment, obsession out of the mind, jealousy, pride, they come and they fly around in all these things. Or to bring in qualities like unconditional love for everybody. London is a great place for that, isn't it? You do your 10 minutes of unconditional love meditation in the morning and you walk out and you go into the maelstrom of London, and then you can see exactly how long you can stay in that mind frame, And sure enough, somebody will very kindly come along and puncture the balloon, and you go, oh, some more work needs to be done here. As you think, very little of what we do in Buddhist practice delivers instant results, does it? We sit. We sit and we try and look at the mind, train the mind, bring the mind to a higher state, or however you want to say it, move along the path. But none of that is like, it's not instant soup. You don't buy the packet, pour the hot water in, and 2 minutes later you're in front of the telly spooning it in your mouth. It's not like that. We work to eradicate unhelpful tendencies, greed, obsession, anger, jealousy, pride, and all the little derivatives that hang around those. They're types of mind, aren't they? There are jealous minds. There are many different moments of mind that fit into these things. And alongside that, we're trying to increase the positive ones like compassion, love, joy, these benevolence, these things. But it's all quite slow progress, at least for me. You think, 2 steps forward, and then it's 3 steps back. But if we don't have faith in these things, we won't do them, In other words, when we have our meditation technique and we sit and we do it day in, day out, regardless of whether it was a good session or a bad session, or we just hack on through it day in, day out, that's a sign that we have faith in that. Because we wouldn't do it otherwise, or we wouldn't do it for the long term, And in our temple in South London, we can see people who come for 2 or 3 years, they get what they need and they go. But then often when I meet them 7 years later, there's no meditation practice left, which is kind of what you hope people would take away. Not the Buddhist part, but just watching the mindfulness, just watching the mind, training the mind, challenging the unenlightenment that we have. If we don't have faith or confidence that these practices achieve the results that we're looking for, we won't start, we won't stay with them very long, and we certainly won't do them for a lifetime. So faith. A little plea, really. Many things in traditional Buddhism challenge us and make us uncomfortable, and they're meant to. One of my root lamas, Gyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche, will spend hours and hours telling you about the hell realms. The cold hells, the hot hells, the suffering of animals, the suffering of... yes, you have the Wheel of Life over there above that. The suffering of the pretas, just hours and hours of it. My first Tawe Lama, if you like, my root Lama, Gyabje Song Rinpoche, I remember very distinctly in Dharamsala, he'd just given us initiation, and he sat and he looked over this group of 50 Westerners, Europeans, Americans, Australians, and he looked out and he said, all of you will go to hell, but at least you'll go to hell with some tantric impressions on your mind. And that's shocking, hang on a minute. We got rid of heaven and hell. Well, certainly in my family we got rid of heaven and hell a long time ago. So these images are quite difficult. I just ask that when we find these difficult things in traditional Buddhism, that we don't just go with our natural, what we know, our prejudice, our, I know it's like this. And we just put them to one side, put them in the pending tray, and every now and again revisit the pending tray. So how do I feel about this now? Do I understand why they're saying these things now? Because when we first meet Buddhism, we know nothing. 5 years down the line, we know slightly more than nothing. Often our practice seems to be going forward and then going back, going forward and then going back. It seems to be a spiral, and it seems to be difficult to see it going up anywhere. But you certainly know where you were quite well by now when you keep on going back. But just to not let another thing my pets hate, there are some awful translations of Buddhist texts. The English is unpleasant, it's stilted, it's, some of them are because they're old, some of them because they don't understand, but sometimes it's just that the person translating hasn't had enough time to digest it and turn it into an English that will inspire, I completely understand that, and it's nice to have rough translations out there than no translation at all. But please, if something doesn't seem workable with when you first meet it, don't just chuck it out. Leave it in the pending tray and revisit and see if you can understand it later on. I'll just give you one example that, for me personally. So, in some of the Buddhist texts, there is an idea that you find that unmarried women over the age of 16 are kind of hyperlibidinous, absolutely up for it all the time. I personally find that idea utterly ridiculous. But there's also an idea that you see very clearly in some of the texts that unprotected women are fair game for any man. And I find that distasteful, actually. But the ideas are there. They're in those traditional texts. And even today in Buddhist countries, if you're a poor woman and you don't have the protection and support of a family, or a husband, or true friends, you are very, very vulnerable to predatory men and women. Very often the young girls who are taken from Bengal and end up in prostitution in Delhi, their introduction has been through an auntie, a friend of the family woman, somebody who's come in. It's not always the men who are being predators. And that, I've seen that in traditional India, but I also heard from a monk that I know who was based in Bhutan, and when he was young, before he went to the monastery, his father died very early, and his mother spent an awful lot of time bolting the door at night and putting serious bars over the door to stop local village men who were married coming along to try it on with her. It was like a battle all the time. Very interesting to hear, for me, very interesting to hear that mind frame was there. So then I understood this idea of the protected woman, if you like, and what it has given to me is the sense that everybody needs some kind of supportive, protective environment. And that's not just there in India or in the exile community, it's also here. If you don't have in London some kind of support network, it's quite easy to end up on the streets or doing little drugs, more drugs, heavy drugs. Suddenly it's taken over your life, alcohol, you name it, if you haven't got the right kind of support network to help you. So, and that's something I feel quite passionate about, and I probably wouldn't have thought about that or wouldn't have engaged with it unless I'd met these hyperlibidinous unmarried women and these unprotected fair game women. So it's the meeting those things that kind of challenged and shocked me has given me some strength in the sense of wanting these things to happen, wanting support to be given to all, not just women, but men as well. That's it. Any questions? Any thoughts? Yes, please.
Yes, I was wanting to ask you a rather specific question about the new Kadampa sect of Tibetan Buddhism.
Right.
Now, my wife and I recently were interested in attending one of their sessions, Introductions to Meditation, which was in Senate House. And there was a talk by an English-born nun on how they approach meditation. The emphasis was always on happiness and peace of mind. There was no mention of unhappiness, sickness, death, which figure in original Buddhism.
Yeah.
It was this bright picture that we were given.
Yeah.
And the second impression was they seem to have enormous financial resources. They've opened about 20 different centres in the London area alone.
Oh, right.
And other things. I wonder if you have any background knowledge on them, what their approach is.
I don't really have a sense of their approach. I mean, I date from the time when they were born, if you like, so in the mid-80s, when they came away from the FPMT, which is the group I belong to. They kind of were born out of that, if you like. I think they share with quite a few other Buddhist groups, including within my own Buddhist group, this thing of you can't tell people about suffering because they won't come back. Certainly within the FPMT, it's a lively discussion between us, with some people going, you can't say to someone you're unenlightened, you can't say to someone that you're going to grow old, grow sick, you'll die, because they won't come back, they won't like to hear, that's what I mean, they don't like to hear that sound. So it's not just them that emphasise the kind of the happy side of it, if you like.
It's almost like kind of semi-commercialised Buddhism.
I don't know how their sales are doing. They're certainly extremely effective operators on the web, that's for sure. They're very good at operating on the web. And it's difficult because actually since the break in the mid-80s, I haven't really engaged with them, and they don't really engage with us. They're just, we both come out of the same stable, if you like, and they've chosen to do these things, and we've chosen to stay with the Dalai Lama and follow his advice, But they certainly seem successful financially, that's for sure.
I don't want to be too cynical, but
no, I mean, and it's not just here, we've, I had a bunch of Japanese come along, well, 2 bunches of Japanese came last year, and there was one that particularly struck with me. There was a young man of maybe 20, 25, and 4 very sweet little girls, not little girls, but young girls with him. And he came in and said, "Oh, you're a Buddhist center," and I said, "I'm starting a Buddhist group." "Oh, that's nice, So what's it come from?" He said, "Well, we don't follow any of the traditional stuff. There's no hell, there's no karma, there's no rebirth, and I'm enlightened." Well, that's nice, And then the other people came from Japan again. It's full of eddies as well in Japan, And these people, they again didn't believe in rebirth, but they believed in karma. They had absolutely no idea of the Four Noble Truths, no idea of a bodhisattva path. It's one of those things where you're just talking with someone and you realise that whatever they're calling Buddhism is just something you don't recognise at all. And I had bits of, they wore bits of Tibetan stuff, and they had the monastic belt from the Theravada, those useful wide belts. It's Kali Yuga, this is the modern age, it's the degenerate age.
Anatta.
No, nothing like that. No, nothing like that. I mean, yes, there are plenty. There was a lovely example in Sarah, in the monastery in the south, the big Tibetan monastery in the south, and Sarah May is one of the colleges there. And a friend of mine was studying Tibetan there, and he said a bunch of French tourists turned up, and they were very, they'd been in Goa for about 5 or 6 weeks, and they came up to have a look, and then there was a full moon, and the next day he saw them all wearing kind of monastic robes, but not, badly put on. And so he talked to the girl who seemed to be running the group and said, so what did you do? She said, it was full moon last night, it's fantastic. So we ordained each other. Okay, whatever. And the trouble is that Tibetans have a view that Westerners are pretty crazy, and when people do this, they think, ticks the box.
One Japanese monastery in Battersea Park, I'm sure you must have visited.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there again, some sort of Gandhian bits have been added to it, and whenever there is Gandhi's birthday, they would sort of take a procession right up to that.
Okay, I don't really know them that well, but they are a very standard Japanese Buddhist group, that particular group. But yes, this is what I mean about we need to be aware, because there's so many things. So many times people come to us and they go, there are all these different Buddhisms. I checked on the web and there are all these different things, and they get utterly confused. And we're not people to say, join us. We say to people, go and study with them for a while, but stay there. Don't just drift in, drift onto another one, drift onto another one. Taste that one fully, then see if it works for you. Then, that kind of, move around and find the tradition that you can work with. Yeah. It's not that I'm fully in the Tibetan tradition. Parts of it irritate me enormously. but it's a constructive irritation. It doesn't. It's something I can work with in the sense that there are other parts that I find incredibly beautiful. The emphasis on, or just these ridiculous ideas of unconditional love for everybody. It's just impossible, but I love it. You know what I mean? It's just so inspiring to think that one day I could do that. One day I could really care for that from the heart for anyone I met. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I mean, it's not happening now, but that really, inspires me. Any other? Yeah.
In countries like Tibet and other Buddhist countries, the culture really supports the religion, but the culture isn't religion. Then when for example, lamas come to the West, obviously some of what they bring is Tibetan culture, some of which then doesn't work very well. I wonder if you've got any views, what kind of a culture would support Buddhism here without being, just a culture from somewhere else that's
what parts of our culture would support Buddhism?
Or what kind of a culture here, without necessarily trying to just take someone else's culture as the container?
You might not like the answer, but the older I've got, the more impressed I am with Christians. I think a lot of good things have come out of Christianity, although it doesn't fit me, if you like. But I think the traditions of modern Christianity maybe are on the better side of Christianity, are enormously supportive of general personal development towards good. So, we've been having sort of running jokes in the office for about a year now, since the new Pope arrived, because Tibetan Buddhism is very hierarchical, and they do like a bit of pomp and ceremony, so much so that on the west coast of America there's this phrase, the brocade circuit of the Tibetan lamas going around, this kind of thing. And if the person's a bit more jaded, they talk about the brocade circus. and we've been joking in the office that what's that going to do, with Catholicism and Tibetan Buddhism? Because the new Pope is clearly not into that at all, is he? He's still not got his red shoes. He still lives in the canteen. There are lots of things, and also just things like, what was it? He was accused of being a communist for some reason, and rather than go into a kind of defence mode or something, he just said, "I know some communists who are really good people, so I take that as a very kind compliment. Thank you." I mean, just completely diffuse it straight away. And we were just joking that maybe the bells and smells under the Catholic religion will start moving into Tibetan Buddhism, and we'll have this problem. Because the Tibetans, they are very, very hierarchical, and they do love their stations, and it doesn't fit with our democratic. Our side is slightly more democratic. I mean, the classic case was when I went to go and see Dalai Lama. He was teaching in Zurich in Switzerland, and as you do, you walk into the hall and there's the throne, and so you go in and you prostrate. Well, to the Swiss, who spent the whole Swiss story is about William Tell not bowing his head to the Austrian overlord. So us going flat down on the floor was just appalling, and it made the news. It made the national news in Switzerland, these people prostrating. And then the next day there were so many Christian groups outside handing out leaflets and handing out sweets as well, which is a very good approach. I like that. But just because of this thing of seeing us abasing ourselves before an empty throne, the Dalai Lama wasn't even on it. But it was that clash of culture, So I think in our culture, the things that I think support Buddhism, and maybe aren't so modern anymore, are respect, politeness.
Non-theistic, atheist or non-atheist.
Yeah, well, just allowing people to believe what they want, in a sense. That I quite like. What was it? It was Queen Elizabeth I who said that she wasn't going to make windows into men's souls. And that's that's part of what I like in the English tradition in particular, that you can be whatever you are. Not frightening the horses in the streets, those kind of basic manners, politeness, but also the things that we need to develop is this respect for Sangha, regardless of whether they've got faults or not. So having an idea of that, these people are trying to do something that I can't do, that's for sure. I tried it and failed. I was a monk for 2.5 years, junior level, but I couldn't do it. Sex and drugs and rock and roll won, hands down. But these people are trying, and I, to me, we need to get more of that sense of honouring that attempt, to give them the respect that happens. It's not to say that when you meet some monks who may be a bit off the wall, or nuns who are a bit off the wall, and there are some floating around, that you don't, tell others not to get too involved with it, but you respect people for trying that. In the same way with meditators, you respect people for trying to meditate. It's a funny thing, we have these things in our minds, don't we? If I can't do it perfectly, I won't do it. So you never start. We had another time down in Sarah in the south, in Indian monasteries in the south. There was this thing, we were staying there, and a friend of mine, she's lovely lady, chaotic, very open-hearted, and so every night she wanted to go out for a cigarette. And the joke with the Lama in the house was that we were going out to do kora, go around the monastery. So for her cigarette, we would walk around the monastery, so she got some kind of benefit from it, if you like. And if you believe in the production of going around holy objects makes merit. But then she had in her head that you either did it 3 times or more, or you didn't do it at all. And sometimes she didn't want to do more than 3 times. And I said, once is okay. And she said, but you have to do it 3 times. I said, no, you do it once, it's better than no times. That kind of, but that it was the classic mind, I can't do it fully, so I don't start, Or I do it, I fall down, so then I stop doing it because I keep on falling down. No, get up, walk on, Did I answer that question at all? Actually, probably not, apart from telling you to become a Christian. Yes.
Yes, I think one thing we could, with advantage, follow Christians on, is really trying to work out intellectually coherent answers to the system questions, such as, should someone professing Buddha Dharma be prepared to fight in war? I mean, we're lucky in this country and we don't have conscription. But if we did have conscription, what advice would we give to 17 or 18-year-olds who are already prepared to hold up papers?
Yes. Yeah.
It's very variable. I put that question to my own practices in the Theravada. So I put that question to Theravada peoples and to say, what advice do you give to some young man around your temple who gets his call-up papers? And you don't get much of an answer. It's very embarrassing. It's a little an answer.
Yeah.
Generally, the answer is, we don't talk about that, that's politics.
Yes.
But I mean, that's bound to seem just devotion.
Yeah.
Because, a young man who's been used to looking towards monks for advice on his practice is entitled to an answer, it seems to me, on that. And I mean, one of the strengths of the Christian tradition in the West, anyway, the Latin part of the older Roman Empire, has been an attempt to work out coherent answers, starting with St. Augustine.
Yes.
Particularly. What are the conditions of a just war?
Yeah. I
mean, war was assumed to be very evil, but Augustine was unwilling to say it's never, under any circumstances, wrong to fight.
And there are many,
I'm not saying the answer's always right or impressive, but there is a serious attempt to address, and I mean, the distribution of wealth in society, another thing.
Yeah.
Other points of social morality.
Yeah.
I mean, what we most urgently need to do, it seems to me, is to try and work out an authentically Buddhist line, a good line to that. Not one to which everyone will agree, of course they won't, just to get the argument going.
Yes. No, I mean, there's a new temple opening up in Aldershot, isn't it? The Nepalese temple, and that's mainly for Gurkhas, soldiers, and soldiers and their families.
Yes.
So, and until that temple starts, the Gurkhas, when Gurkhas die, their families come to our temple to make the offerings and do the the traditional offerings. And it's very interesting to watch what's Buddhist and what isn't. In the Gurkha tradition, somebody dies, not Gurkha as in Gurkhas as the tribe, but people who get into the Gurkha regiment. The Buddhists come to us, and then so up on the altar you have the lights, remembering them, and then you have their favourite food and their favourite things. And nearly always there's a can of ale and a packet of fags next door. And there's normally a meat curry. And we've had terrible problems with our volunteers who are just shocked that somebody offers a meat curry up on the altar. And then we just say that's their culture within their part. And then we show them the old pictures in Mongolia before they destroyed the temples, where there's a wonderful picture of this beautiful statue of Chenrezig like this, and then you have these stacked dead sheep standing on their legs like this, just stacked up around the side of the altar, because that's what Mongolians do, So there are huge questions that we do need to debate, yes. But debate in a gentle and accepting style, rather than getting into kind of frenetic fighting and stuff like that, because there's nothing worse than brawling Buddhists, I'm afraid, when you see it come up in the newspapers or, there's nothing worse.
Extremely bad for our reputation when we see that examples of the persecution of non-Buddhists in Burma, say, which very clearly look like a form of sort of racial prejudice expressing itself in persecution.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Buddhist eyes, after a fashion.
Yeah. But I think, but there's also that thing of we need to be clear that a lot of traditional Buddhisms will not listen to Europeans because we're kind of new in the game.
Yes.
But we can have the discussion with the younger generations in Asia, because they too are questioning their religions quite dramatically. I mean, the most interesting discussion I've had in the last year has definitely been with a bunch of mainland Chinese Buddhists who were studying in Imperial College, and I gave a talk to them, and then they asked questions afterwards. And you can see that they are coming from a scientific tradition and meeting Buddhism. It's not in their family, It's been lost in their family. So they're kind of like us in that sense of finding the way. It's very interesting, yeah. But I agree that discussion needs to start across the piece. Sorry.
Isn't part of the issue that there isn't a central authority in Buddhism to espouse these issues, like a pope or an archbishop of Canterbury?
Completely, yeah.
So we have this. I mean, this discussion is ongoing. It's just who's going to formulate a position for us. But
Yes, I think that's right. Augustine trying to work out conditions for a just war, I don't think he had any higher authority in mind. He just presented it as, sort of grounded in reason with reference to the Christian tradition of his own time and to the New Testament backing of it.
But it's not that there aren't any Buddhist positions on these moral issues.
I mean, yes, there are, but my impression is always that we don't think the thing through rigorously enough to be able to say that, to be able to have a secure basis for giving advice to people when advice is necessary, or for taking up a coherent position on political points. We won't agree, but I feel if they help, if there was some sort of argument, because at least show what we're thinking about them.
No, I mean, the lack of a central authority. Before the Olympics, the kind of Home Office anti-terrorist team came round to us. There was also a couple of Buddhist temples got attacked in North London, I think. But the Home Office man, I remember, the terrorism man came round and were bang opposite a section house, a police section house, which was going to be part of the anti-terrorism hubs across London. So obviously they wanted to check us out. And then he turned up and said, "So, who's the head Buddhist?" And I went, "Well, there isn't one." And he said, "So, how do you make decisions?" And we go, "Well, we kind of just do the things ourselves." And you could see him just thinking, "Oh no." And then we said, he said, "So who can I talk to?" And we said, "Well, talk to the Buddhist Society on the one hand and talk to the MBO on the other hand." And he went, "Will that cover everyone?" I went, "No, not at all." But that's part of the joy, I think, of Buddhism for me. I'm not terribly good at being told what to do, and I need to kind of work these things through myself. I mean, my teacher has accepted the fact that if you tell me to do something, I'll probably do the reverse. So he'll suggest that I do it and then go, "I know you're going to try and do the reverse, but I'd really recommend you don't do that." But yeah.
Well, people have always, have asked, the Buddhist Society, why we, have an endorsing authority for the armed services chaplaincy. Why do we do it? Because, to kill is wrong. But the thing is, I suppose everybody needs to at least have some contact with the Dharma.
Yes, and also, there are many good qualities in military training. There are many good qualities: courage, loyalty. These are good qualities.
But also, your entry point into any religious path depends on your own. Well, we use the word karma, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's
causes and conditions, and where you hear it, what you make of it, and what you're prepared to do with it.
Yeah.
There isn't an absolute truth in that sense. It's a path.
But yes,
And
Buddhism is very situational.
Depends on where you are. The other thing that struck me about your talk is this problem of faith. Because what the Buddha was really talking about was fear. All the time, I suppose. And the one thing that Buddhism actually does, or practice does, it reduces fear and anxiety. So there is a trust, not in an idea, but just a trust in the fact that you're not going to get all upset because something's happened to you. You're not going to be upset because you get ill. You're not going to be upset because your best friend you might be upset, but it'll pass. So to do trust as much as a physically based thing and not an intellectually based thing. And I think that's very different often from Western religions, which seem to be... I remember hearing somebody say, I lost my faith in God because my mother died, and I was so attached to her. And when she died, I couldn't believe anymore. And but this has nothing to do with the sort of trust or faith that Buddhism is talking about. It's not an idea of a benevolence or anything like that.
No, it's an experiential thing, isn't it? You know it because you've tried it. Yes,
But the other thing is that all these traditions, whether it's Tibetan Buddhism or Thailand, have grown up over hundreds of years, many hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, and they are complete in themselves within that culture. It's not that that they represent anything particularly different. It's just that within the culture, they are complete, and they've met all the human problems that are possible, more or less possible, within that culture. But the melting pot in Europe and in the West kind of creates a kind of intellectually challenging chaos, or can be, because you don't see it like that. You see it as conflicting ideas, not conflicting methods, within a context. And that creates a lot of confusion in people. So people then go around mixing and matching. They cherry pick from one tradition. They don't like something in a particular tradition, and they go to another tradition and pull that out. Whereas it seems that if you can really go through one training, then you suddenly realize that all religions and all the Buddhist paths are basically the same. There isn't really a difference at its core root between Christianity and Buddhism, or Buddhism and Islam, or any of those things. They're all actually more or less the same. They just have different roots, different ways, different language, different metaphors, different ways of just experiencing the same trust and sense of benevolence of the world, and so on. Not that they eradicate evil or bad things happening, but it's the human, experience of what is truth.
Yeah, and also just people trying, to move along the path, to develop, to be kinder, more wise, more gentle. You can meet that in any religion, really, and you can also meet the opposite in any religion. And again, it falls back on you to use your own, not innate wisdom, but just be a little bit. Go into any situation, any Buddhism, any religion, any group, with your eyes wide open. Just see how it is and see whether it works for you, because we all have different karmic mixes, so the different things will work for different people. Thank you. It's well beyond 7:30, so those of you who want to rush away, rush now. Otherwise,
Any time for another question, Mike?
Yes, I'm quite happy,
Quick
yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Just wondered what you think about the role of rewards in religious ethics. For example, Christians are basically told that if they lead a good life, they go to heaven. And Buddhists are told that they will have a better life if they follow the precepts of Buddhism. Do you ever think about this? How far is this an ethical procedure?
I have to say I don't, because in Buddhism it's that proof of the pudding is in the eating, if you know what I mean. So all that come and taste quality. And for some people it does. Some people seem to respond to stick and carrot, and others don't. And I think it comes down to methods. For one person, if that method works and it helps them to become more compassionate, more wise, more loving, more generous, then great. But if it doesn't, there are plenty of other methods as well. I'm not I find it quite difficult, some of the kind of banking type metaphors you get with karma, you put your good karma in the bank and then it turns into punya, into merit, and then, you know what I mean. I can see it works for other people, but it doesn't work for me, and I think that's the thing we always have to be aware of, as Desmond was saying, there are many, many methods, and it's, even if you take one method, we learn all about these things all through Buddhism, and I'm just as bad as anyone else. And one of my teachers last year, I asked the question, but I forgot to say, for the temple, what do we do now? Should we have a different kind of initiation? I just said, what should we do now? And he looked at me and he said, I've given you loads of methods over the year. You have to start practicing one, otherwise you'll be a jack of all trades and a master of none. And there's quite often that thing in Tibetan Buddhism, the meditation on love, may love, may we be happy, may someone be happy. Not clingy, gluey stuff like that, but just may someone be happy. First of all, yourself, then everyone in this room, then all the people you know, then everybody, including your enemies. If you did that for the whole of your life, I'm sure, at the end of it, even if there's no life afterwards, you're going to be happier, you're going to be more relaxed. Things happen and you're not going to worry so much. But I do happen to believe there is a future life. And if you spent the whole of your life immersing yourself in love, it's got to be better. I just can't believe it's going to, if your mind is soaked in love, soaked in concern, and you die, great. That answer.
I think there's a problem about being primarily motivated by getting something for yourself.
But that's what a lot of people are motivated by. If you take the traditional Tibetan presentation of the path, you have the three religious scopes or outlooks. One is that you do your religious practice in order to get a better human life in your next life, or to become a god, to have more resources, a happier life. The next one is that you actually realize that being unenlightened is a load of rubbish and you need to stop being unenlightened, to leave samsara, as the traditional phrase. And then the third one is that you realize that you're not alone. Everybody has unenlightenment problems and you need to start working for their benefit as well. But and so when you get the Lam Rim teachings, I've forgotten the name of the translator. His Holiness had a translator who would say things like, so now we're going to do meditation, so wish to have a precious human rebirth in your next life and make, that. And now upgrade your motivation. And then upgrade your motivation like, handing in your phone and getting a new one. But I quite like the idea, you start off with, people do things for themselves. People come to our temple, they're not coming to our temple generally to help all sentient beings. They're coming because they themselves have pain and they want that pain lessened. That's selfish. But if after 4 or 5 years and coming to that they realize that other people have pain and that they can help other people have less pain, then, as far as I'm concerned, game on, they've won. And if they leave the next day and they still have that motivation, great, game on, they've won. You know what I mean? We're not in the numbers game in our temple. In fact, I met somebody he's quite strong in the Samizong, and he said, "Oh, it's you. Yes, I went to your temple, and you told me to go, not just to come to your temple, but to go and look at other ones. I went to Samizong and I never went back." Okay. So, yeah.
I just asked a question just on meditation. A while ago, I had sort of challenged my nephew at the time, who was 14, to sit still and do some meditation for like 5 minutes, because he said he probably could. And I was amazed to kind of see the pain on his face after like 3 minutes of trying to still the mind. Is there a place for like meditation, like the school system, that would help kids? Because I know they're all into the games and stuff at the moment. It was just strange to see how hard it was for him to, just to be still.
There's a huge place in schools for kind of basic mindfulness meditation, because so many kids actually have huge levels of stress, and particularly it's not so much the games when they're killing each other in the game, but the Facebook thing and the number of likes and dislikes and the internet bullying that's going on. That's really something that I know wasn't around when I was there. You just had the bully. You didn't have people all over the world chipping in. But we have the same thing. Schools come to us, and it's very interesting to watch some of the brightest pupils. You say, "Okay, we're gonna meditate for 5 minutes." You never ever do 5 minutes. So everyone sits down, and some of them are like, they're like Vicky Pollard, yeah, whatever. But some of them will really give it a go, and then you say, "Okay," and then after 2 minutes you stop it, and then you say, "How was it?" And some of them go, "I just couldn't say." Although I sat still, my mind was racing. Or I couldn't even sit still, and it's a wake-up call for some of them. They just go, "Wow, am I really that addicted to action?" So yes, definitely a place in every school, every life. I think needs a bit of mindfulness in there.
Can I make a contribution to that? Well, there is a thing called the Horn Foundation, which has been doing it in America, introducing, I think it's 5 minutes of sitting still between lessons, or the beginning of each lesson. They found that the grades have gone up enormously. It's in the public school system. It's also been done in a movement called the Sai movement, Sai schools, and they've got them throughout Thailand, some in India. I think there may even be some in the West. But there's two things they do. One is quiet sitting before each lesson, and the other is they sing together. So in assembly, the whole school sings together. And that seems to create a sort of sense of harmony and peace amongst all the students. And there again, they found the grades going steadily upwards since it's been introduced, right across the board. Not that everyone becomes brilliant, but the lowest go up a few steps and the cleverer ones go up a bit more. So it's been incredibly useful, and it's made, generally speaking, apparently, it's been very, very beneficial. And they're hoping, they did try and introduce it here. And they may be making more progress, but one of the problems was it's got to be introduced as non-religious, as a secular what can we call it, skill or exercise. If they get the idea that it's religious, it's not allowed. They can't do it.
Yeah, or an Eastern religion.
Yeah, or an Eastern. Yeah, it certainly can't be done.
Yeah. Good question. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.